Шановні колеги, продовжуємо.
Dear colleagues, good afternoon, good morning. So we continue, and now we will be discussing when in Ukraine will be a Vice Prime Minister and Euro integration. Our guests will be Vadym Triukhan, Head of the Board of NGO European Movement of Ukraine, Director of Coordination Bureau for European and Euroatlantic Integration in 2008-2010, Oleksandr Sushko, Scientific Director at Institute for Euroatlantic Cooperation, Lubov Akulenko, Coordinator, Stronger Together Information Campaign, and Yaroslav Yurchyshyn, Reanimation Package of Reforms, expert on parliamentary lobbying.
Андрій Андрушків, actually. Good morning, dear journalists. I'd like to explain why we are holding this event today. Tomorrow is the 21st of March, and a year ago the political part of the association agreement was signed. A year has passed, and we've gathered here to remind of a very important thing: the implementation of the association agreement. Efficient implementation cannot be a chaotic movement. In order for this process to be efficient, there has to be an engine, a person who would assume all the responsibility for the implementation of the legislation of the European Union, and who will help our business to break through to European Union's market. And I tell you, we have to break through there, because at the moment it is rather difficult to do. In August, the government office on issues of European integration was created, but at the moment this is insufficient, because it does not matter what is the level of the office, but what matters is whether they have political weight and whether they do everything in order to push the process forward. My personal opinion is that this body does not work efficiently. First, recently the report on the implementation of the association agreement was published, and this is good. But when I analyzed the part that pertained to the free trade area, I saw a very comic thing. A lot of achievements pertaining to food safety was not mentioned there. Very strange. On the one hand, the government cannot but mention their achievements, but on the second hand, this means that there's not a person in this office who would know the food safety issues. And all the legislation that was adopted on the free trade agreement was adopted because of the very simple reason. We have been pressuring the authorities in order to pass the legislation so that our manufacturers make it to the European market. But we should not substitute for the government, because otherwise in this case we would always be losing. We do not have the access to the information that is ready available for the government. So we have to find a person who will have an unbelievable political weight and will carry us on their shoulders to the European family. At the moment, I'm giving the floor to Vadym Triukhan, who in 2008 was head of the Coordination Bureau for European and Euroatlantic integration, and let him tell us how that body worked and how we should build the work of the Vice Premier on European integration. Once Henry Kissinger said, "Whom should I call in Europe in order to talk to them?" And he meant that there was no chief responsible person in Europe who would be engaged in the dialogue with the USA. At the moment, we don't have the similar situation in Europe. If anyone from European politicians or bankers or donors asks whom I should call in Ukraine to talk about integration and reforms, we'll have to say no one. We don't have such a person. In Ukraine, we had 2 attempts to introduce a high-ranking official who would be responsible for European integration. First in 2005, when Oleg Rybachuk was a vice premier on these issues, and then later when Grigory Nemyria held this position. After this, we didn't have such an experience. However, Mr. Khrushchevsky was for a very brief time holding this office, so both Rybachuk and Nemyria were able to enliven the integration with the processes. When Rybachuk launched the plan for the association agreement preparation, and Nemyria was heading the efforts aimed at the free trade agreement. And more than that, because of his efforts, Ukraine completed the negotiations on joining the WTO, which opened further way. But Rybachuk or Nemyria both did not have a powerful center which would concentrate the efforts on European integration, and that's why they had problems in reaching breakthroughs in this area. And the experience shows that in some 90%, those countries that proclaim that they want to join the European Union and fulfill association agreements, they adopt 2 key decisions. First of all, a political figure of high level is designated who coordinates all the efforts, and the necessarily internal reforms according to the norms and standards of the European Union, and secondly, a powerful executive body is created, maybe a bureau, maybe an agency. So, as the experience of those countries that joined the European Union over the last 20 years shows, in this case, the country is able to prepare for joining the EU and is able to implement reforms that will bring the country closer to the standards of the European Union. Ukraine is now in a very precarious situation, not only because there is a war against us in the east and Crimea is annexed, but also because for the entire 23 years of independences, we have not started de-Sovietization and Europeization of our country. And the society now demands not talk, but deeds and reforms targeted at building European life in Ukraine. So it is necessary now to get away from political speculations and trade in offices, and we have already heard statements from the parliament that some people are claiming for them a first vice prime minister position. So ideally, we should introduce the office of the first vice prime minister responsible for European integration and also create an agency responsible for reforms. At the moment, we don't have such a joint center. There's a president's program, there is a prime minister's program for reforms, and we should create an expert effort and center that would engage in implementing reforms according to the association agreement. We've been thinking about this idea in our public society, civil society, and we hope that the coalition to which the president, the head of the parliament, and the prime minister belong will come to this idea themselves, because it was, by the way, in the draft coalition agreement. However, because this decision is not taken yet and time is running, we decided to suggest that our leaders accelerate the process and fill the gap which Ukraine now has. So the word goes to Oleksandr Sushko, Scientific Director of Institute for Euroatlantic Cooperation. He is now very actively involved in the Ukrainian part of the platform of civil society created according to the association agreement. So let him share the information whether the platform's work is influenced by the lack of prime minister and whether the vice prime minister will help them work more efficiently. Thank you very much. The platform is a separate story, a story of its own. It's not formed yet. Finally, we hope that it will happen in April. And then we will talk about the efficiency or inefficiency and the underwater rocks on this way. However, if we talk about the issue of the topic of our press briefing, I'd like to remind you of another attempt to introduce the position of the Vice Premier on Euro-integration. When the first Maidan government was being formed, Arseniy Yatsenyuk publicly said that he offers the office of the Vice Prime Minister for Euro-integration to Boris Tarasyuk. More than that, Tarasyuk was on the stage of Maidan as a candidate for the Vice Prime Minister on European integration. However, the next day he decided to reject this offer, saying that within the current structure of the government, the office of the Vice Premier on European integration is a token one, and there is no real staff or authority behind this office. As an experienced politician and administrator, he weighed all pros and cons and understood that he won't be able to influence anything, and in the best case will sign some papers in Brussels. So he took this decision for himself, but this resulted in the fact that the idea of the office of the Vice Prime Minister in European integration was pulled back into background, and as a result we lived this year without such an office. Without going into further details, to which extent this offer to Tarasyuk at the moment was well thought of, I have to recognize, and this is my contribution to this discussion, I wouldn't raise an issue or actively fight for the introduction of this office in order to introduce this office. And in this I agree with Vadym when he said that the decision about the Vice Prime Minister is per se hangs in the air, which, because it can do nothing without the institutional bulwark on which the Vice Prime Minister should base his or her work. And the experts here see the solution of this problem in different ways. Vadym is consistent in his idea of the support of a separate special body of executive power, a ministry or an office or an agency. And some other experts think that you can lean upon the institutional structure of the current office on European integration in the Secretariat of the Cabinet of Ministers, of course broadening it both numerically and where its authority is concerned, and the set of experts, but nevertheless the sense is in moving forward, pushing through a set of issues, among which the issue of the appointment of the Vice Prime Minister is a sort of a structure under which a certain structure should be. We should look at the distribution of duties in the government in general, because now we have a Prime Minister who declares his preparedness to oversee this topic of European integration, and he actually heads the Committee on European Integration, which formally was set up in December. However, we see that Prime Minister does not have enough time and opportunity to personally, in a quality way, oversee those issues.
On the one hand, it is seems that it's good when the Prime Minister takes responsibility, and the situation is like the responsibilities of Prime Ministers in our crisis times. He could only deal with the Euro integration issues as a secondary line of activity. At the same time, it is obvious that if we are speaking of appointing of such a position, such a person, then immediately we have a big amount of underground streams and underwater streams that is limiting this opportunity not only in the project, in the draft coalition agreement, one positions, one standpoints, one part of the kind of standpoints were issued, but we are dealing with a set of factors. One of the major factor here is some fears in the governmental top layer that it will be an alternative influential center in the government, which is a position not number one, number two, who probably will be a shadow prime minister and in the future could be a competitor to the prime minister. And I believe that this consideration is probably the major one for the fact that prime minister is not very eager to put this into agenda, means this issue. So there are several candidates, probably 5 of them, that have been considered, and not a single candidate they dealt with is not good 100%. We have a lot of good professionals, but they are heavyweights not in the politics. There are heavyweights in politics that are not professionals. And some people, they are not that much trusted, etc., etc. So the issue is being postponed once and once again. But today we understand that it is a great need to reinforce this part of government. And probably government will be enough decisive that to appoint somebody for this position, or probably will be an option for them, less risky, maybe better for us. This is a set of problems, and everything is weaved in our traditional fabric of traditional influential competition. Means on one hand you have a president with his faction, the biggest in the coalition, and he understands that it must be a person from this faction. But immediately in that case will be a competition between the prime minister and his first deputy on European integration. Probably the parties they have this as reasons, and they understand that it is better for them to postpone this issue rather than put a stress on that. And I agree that today we of course can observe certain negative consequences. At the same time, it's not a panacea that could be good for solving all that issues. And I'm not that critical to people that Vadym already mentioned. Of course, Rybachuk and Nemira, their presence or their experiences, the argument against are revival of this type. We must have some other model. We must have a better step ahead. And in that case, I believe that the public society has all the civic society has all the prerequisites to put this as a priority. Thank you, Oleksandr, for your conclusions. I would like to say a couple of reflections on his comment that this position was introduced in due time, headed by Mr. Rybachuk, Mr. Nemira. But with all respect to Rybachuk and Nemira, they are not experts in foreign trade. So we need somebody who is involved in transport logistics, because we dealt with the logistics in Soviet Union, and now we have to develop this streamline in European Union. And we must find somebody who understands how Ukrainian enterprises could switch over to European standards. We must adopt legislation very fast in order to remove all the obstacles or to accept all the barriers in the trade with the European Union. Last fall, there was a mission from EU, evaluated or estimated our diaries, and they issued the criticism, so nobody knows it will be negative or positive conclusion of this mission. And if negative, then we lost 1 year. Only in 1 year we could invite another mission. When Rybachuk and Nemira occupied this position, then it was a different environment. We didn't have war, so we must very strong man, very strong structure, and somebody who could understand all the peculiarities of trade between EU and other countries. I would like to give floor to Andrei Andrushki from Reanimation Package of Reform. The people that we are working closely with, they agreed to support us in promotion of the idea of public appointment of Vice Prime Minister. I give floor to Andrei.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I have been delegated to here by more than 300 experts working within the RPR, all the changes to the legislation in a variety of areas. I'd like to demonstrate 2 points. First of all, our experts see it on a daily basis that there is a huge lack of these entry points in the cabinet, of this person inside the cabinet, which would help identify whether the suggested drafts and pieces of legislation comply with European integration vector, with the association agreements. At this moment, such decisions are made at the level of line ministries, and they do it on their own. And we need this joint entry point in the cabinet, and we need a person, a fully fledged official, and better it be a vice prime minister. Another consideration that our experts mention: if we want to have the most top-notch competent person at this position with the least possible level of corruption, then such person should be subject to open public competition. If we are to elect the president in an open public competition, if we do it for our MPs, why should we not use the same procedure for an official deemed to open the window to Europe for us? Representatives of civic society are really ready to present the RPR as a kind of platform to discuss and evaluate candidates to such a position, and we are ready to work in this direction. because we have witnessed for almost a year a total breaking of this kind of efforts. Just to wrap it up and to finalize the suggestions voiced here, I'd like to announce that together with the RPR and the Stronger Together campaign, we want to publicly address the President of Ukraine, calling him to initiate public hearings on nomination of vice presidents for European integration, and we fully comprehend how complex the process will be. And together with RPR, we are going to launch our own public competition, and we heartily invite all the decent candidates to do so and to apply. We will create a separate mailbox on Ukrainian Pravda website, and we would like to invite all experts to present their recommendations of potential nominees. The key criteria are that such a person needs to have a clear-cut agenda, and for that purpose there should be a team behind such a person. Secondly, such a person should be well versed in trade-related negotiations within the scope of association agreement, and this person needs to be very professional in trade-related policies in Ukraine and in the EU. And finally, such a person should have lustration clearance, and we will circulate this our statement. We will send it to the President, and we will announce our applications and call for proposals from prospective candidates, because we do want that all the range of problems that our entrepreneurs have to come across are finally resolved, and that the process of European integration unfolds in necessary direction. We really need green wave here to have all the related association measures to be as hassle-free as possible. We thank you for your attention. I'd like to thank our experts. There is time for questions. Oksana Mitnitska, Crisis Media Center, I have a question to you. What, in your opinion, should be the agenda for the first year of such Vice President on European integration? And what kind of authority such a government official should have, not being just blank nominee, but being some real liaison with European partners? With your permission, I'd like to split this question. I will respond about the agenda. As we are mostly dealing with trade-related issues, we see lots of problems in this regard, and I think that such person should be really knowledgeable about how to eliminate all trade-related barriers in external trade relations, particularly in the area of safety of food products, because it is of paramount importance and exceptionally hard to penetrate food products market in the EU. The person should have an idea how to proceed with technical regulations and their implementation in the industry. The person should propose certain vision of customs regulation and how it should be improved, given the abysmal situation in the Ukrainian customs at the moment. Many importers really complaining about it. Then we have this need to have this one-stop shop window in a real meaning of it. And the final area that this person should have included in his agenda is the competition area, because we do need to keep afloat our business persons. We need to upkeep the competitiveness. The Anti-Monopoly Committee is currently just working as a war dog, not as a supporting agency. So finally, this nominee, potential nominees, should be also knowledgeable about how to make our industries transit to higher, better European standards. because see, Russian companies, after certain problems, they can do it really easy, but this can be a huge problem for small and medium enterprises. This is personal belief and understanding of about the agenda of such potential nominee, and I think probably Vadym is best to tell about political weight of such person, such candidates. You know, in 2008, 2010, it appeared that according to the current legislation on the cabinet of ministers, the vice ministerial positions are not authorized to come up with draft legislation of the legislative initiative. So we, at that time, we were in the Coordination Bureau for European and Euroatlantic integration. Whenever we wanted to design a new piece of legislation, we had to address some line ministry, some committee requesting their involvement. And I think that if we are to introduce this position, we need certain changes to the regulations on the cabinet of ministers to expand the scope of authority of prime ministers. First, as regards the legislative initiative. Secondly, Oleksandr was right when he mentioned about the reasons why Tarasuk declined this position, what were peculiar features of the time, at the time of Rybachuk and Nemiria. It is right, and I can add here that with establishing such a position and by setting up a relevant structure for that position, we will necessarily need to really amalgamate certain scope of authority from other ministries, because these ministries do have such authorizations, but they do not use it. This concerns, first of all,
why this body is not reporting to the first vice prime minister. Secondly, the issue of technical assistance management, which is under the auspice of the Ministry of Economy, but when we are looking at the technical assistance from European Union and the results or deliveries we have, that's a great gap between the amount and efficiency. That's why technical assistance in first place must be in the responsibilities of this body, and the adaptation of legislation as well, which is related to EU markets access. Again, training of experts, training of specialists. We have a great deficiency of that, specialists that are familiar with the European legislation, adaptation to European legislation. At Viktor Yanukovych time, in the majority of our higher school, the chairs of European integration, they were liquidated. This chair, for instance, was cancelled even in the diplomatic academy. After Yanukovych fled from the country, such department was liquidated in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, higher school. It was a very powerful department. It was liquidated, and the Vice Prime Minister has to establish a work in the country that is related to training of proper experts. And once more, within the last year, the number of Ukrainian citizens that support Euro integration has increased. It was something like 44% in December of 2013. By December of 2014, it was 67%. It doesn't mean that people start understand what is European integration. What does it mean? This is a phenomenon, and people, they must understand that our intention is to integrate into European structures rather than Russia or something. So we must establish communication to broad public, and the result of this communication should be that our citizen understands what is European integration without any excessive expectations, because we do not only have positive results, we'll have positive results, but as well we must have certain sacrifices. And this Vice Prime Minister must be responsible for, say, providing for proper work. And if everything is gathered in his hand, in the hand of this Prime Minister, then we will achieve success in this work. Any questions, please? Please introduce yourself. Volodymyr Didov-Kobzar, Council of the President of European Business Assembly, Oxford, was President of the Business Circle of Ukraine, People's President of the Maidan Republic. I liked your comment, Luba, on all of that. I know all of that prime ministers personally who worked not for the people of Ukraine but for their own pocket, and I know all the reformators. And the question is, I would like to... I know the heads of the Reanimation Package of Reform, they were grant eaters, so to say. And I met Hanna Hopko, who was the number one among Sotniks. Question. Do you think that Vice Premier must have deeper function and additional functions, because we forgot about more than 20 million Ukrainians abroad that are present in the UN. This is the part of our country. They do not work for Ukraine as a ministry of propaganda. There are many people involved in business. They would like to work with us, but due to the fact that we have a total corruption in the country and nothing like an intention to have deeper reforms in Ukraine, doesn't it need that the Vice Prime Minister to have a function of cooperation with the Ukrainians abroad and propaganda? Because Ukraine, this is... Thank you. Thank you for your question. I'll try to partly answer, and Vadym and Oleksandr, they probably will have their intervention in that. As for the assistance from Ukrainian diaspora, in fact, we have this assistance already. Speaking of trade, Ukrainian producers, for them, the easiest way to come to European market is to establish contacts with Ukrainian diaspora, and many manufacturers, I know many of them, they reach the EU markets this way, and diaspora, of course, assist them. Vice Premier, I believe he must undertake this function to communicate, to coordinate with many donors, investment donors, that would be ready to invest into our Ukrainian manufacturers, for them to switch over European standards. Would it be diaspora or some other structures? It doesn't mean, but I believe that It must be his responsibility, because today the small and medium business is rather difficult for SME to find themselves by themselves this structure. The only one way to get funding for them is to say get some subsidies for small and medium businesses, but this opportunity exists only for EU member states, means that they must register or incorporate themselves in Poland or some other countries of EU. You nearly said everything I wanted to say. The only one thing I add, let us remember the first weeks after Revolution of Dignity won. There was a discussion that in Ukraine will be a donor conference of donors to accumulate certain amount of money to support reforms. Now we have 20th of March, year 2015. Does anybody hear anything about this conference? I understand this is 5th or 6th postponing, and the conference they named it before donors conference, next investment conference. So the primary task for Vice Prime Minister in European integration, and by the way I would like to stress it, that it's not only Euro integration but reforms in fact. So it must be a conference of reform support. It must be very clear agenda, very specific projects, and Ukraine has to have technical or financial assistance for this. And it must coordinate work with our powerful diaspora organizations, with the international financial institutions that are able to support Ukraine, and to take the political responsibility for results of that work. Thank you very much, dear experts. I understand that you will hold control over this topic. Will it be Prime Minister, Vice Prime Minister? But of course we would like that our business circles to have some kind of protector in our government. Thank you very much, dear